The afternoon sun has always been particularly possessive of this room. It doesn't just enter, it claims the space, filtering through the heavy, dust-rose velvet drapes I hung myself 40 years ago. It catches the floating dust motes, tiny suspended galaxies dancing in the silence, and illuminates the intricate patterns of the Persian rug beneath my feet. I sat in my wingback chair, the one upholstered in a faded floral tapestry that has seen 3 generations of spaniels and 2 generations of toddlers. My needles clicked and clacked, a rhythmic, hypnotic metronome counting down the seconds of my piece. I was working on a throw blanket, a complex cable knit in a soft heather gray wool. The tactile sensation of the yarn slipping through my fingers usually calms me, grounding me in the present moment. On the mahogany side table, my cup of Earl Grey sat steaming, the bergamot aroma distinct and sharp, a sophisticated comfort I have allowed myself every day at 3 o'clock since 1975. The house was breathing around me, settling into its foundations with the familiar creaks and groans of a grand Victorian dame resting her bones. It was perfect. It was mine. And then the atmosphere was shattered. It wasn't a knock. It was the heavy, presumptuous thud of the front door being thrown open, followed immediately by the aggressive staccato of high heels striking the hardwood of the foyer. Click, clack, click, clack, fast, angry, lacking the grace of a woman who understands the soul of a house like this. The sound reverberated off the wainscoting, destroying the sanctity of my afternoon. Jessica swept into the living room like a localized weather event. She is 26, sharp-angled, and perpetually dissatisfied. Before she even spoke, her scent arrived. A wave of synthetic, overpowering vanilla perfume that coated the back of my throat, instantly warring with the delicate citrus notes of my tea. It was thick, cheap, and suffocating. She didn't greet me. She didn't ask about my health. She marched to the center of the room, her eyes darting around the space as if she were already measuring the walls for demolition. In her manicured hand, she clutched a sheaf of glossy papers. With a theatrical flick of her wrist, she tossed them onto the small, antique coffee table in front of me. They landed with a slap, sliding across the polished wood and coming to rest dangerously close to my china saucer. The vibration nearly tipped the cup. Tea sloshed perilously near the rim, a dark amber tide threatening to stain the lace. Doily. "It's done, Martha," Jessica announced. Her voice was brittle, devoid of warmth. "We found a place, Shady Oaks. It's affordable and they have a shuttle bus. You need to pack your bags. We need this room for the nursery." I stopped knitting. I didn't look up immediately. Instead, I looked at the brochures. The top one featured a photograph of a bleak gray concrete building that looked more like a minimum security prison than a home. The grass in the photo was dead, and the elderly woman smiling in the foreground looked like she had been superimposed onto the image by a novice graphic designer. Shady Oaks. The name itself was an insult to botany. "This is my home, Jessica," I said, my voice quiet, steady. I kept my eyes on the glossy paper, studying the fine print at the bottom regarding visitation hours. "I've lived here for 50 years. My husband built the gazebo in the back. My son took his first steps on this rug." Jessica sneered. It was an ugly expression that twisted her heavily lined lips. "It was your home," she corrected, leaning down, her hands bracing on the table, invading my personal space. "But Mark handles the bills now, doesn't he? We can't afford this mortgage and a baby and you being a burden. The heating bill alone is ridiculous. Be ready by Friday." Friday. 3 days. She was evicting me from half a century of life in 3 days. I slowly lifted my gaze to the doorway. There, hovering in the shadows of the hall, stood Mark. My grandson, the boy I had raised when his own parents were too busy chasing their careers. I remembered holding him in this very chair when he had the chicken pox, reading to him until my voice went hoarse. He was wearing his work suit, looking down at his expensive Italian leather shoes I knew I had paid for. He couldn't meet my eyes. He was studying the grain of the floorboards, shrinking into himself, letting his wife do the dirty work. His silence was louder than her shouting. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of complicity. He was letting this happen. He was trading his history for a quiet life with a woman who smelled like cheap vanilla and ambition. My hands began to tremble. I tucked them quickly beneath the half-finished gray wool of the blanket, hiding the weakness. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me shake. They interpreted my silence as shock, as the frail confusion of a senile old woman who can't comprehend the changing world. Jessica straightened up, looking triumphant. She adjusted her blouse, satisfied that the problem had been dealt with. "We'll bring some boxes down later," she said dismissively, turning her back to me. "Come on, Mark." They left the room. The clicking of her heels faded, followed by the softer, shuffling tread of my grandson. I sat there for a long time, the silence slowly knitting itself back together around me. The sun had shifted, the light now falling directly across the Shady Oaks brochure, illuminating the hollow promise of dignified living printed in bold Comic Sans. I reached out, my hand no longer trembling, and picked up my teacup. The china rattled ever so slightly against the saucer, a tiny porcelain bell tolling the end of an era. I took a sip. The tea was cold now, bitter on the tongue. They think they have won. They think I am just an old woman in a floral chair, easily uprooted, easily discarded like an out-of-date receipt. Jessica sees a burden. Mark sees a shameful obligation. But as I looked at the glossy brochure, a different thought crystallized in my mind, sharp and cold as a diamond. They have forgotten who signed the original deed. They have forgotten that before I was a grandmother, I was the daughter of a barrister and the wife of a banker. I didn't just live in this house. I curated its secrets. I set the cup down precisely in the center of the saucer. I picked up the brochure and smoothed it out on my lap. Did they really think they could remove me from the board so easily? The front door slammed shut, the heavy reverberation shaking the crystal chandelier in the foyer just enough to make the prisms tinkle. The sound signaled their departure, Jessica dragging Mark to some trendy bistro to toast their victory with overpriced cocktails. As the rumble of Mark's car faded down the gravel driveway, the silence returned to the house. But this time, it wasn't the peaceful silence of the afternoon. It was the charged, electric silence of a battlefield before the first cannon fires. I set the knitting aside on the side table, placing the needles perfectly parallel. I stood up. The stiffness in my knees, which I had exaggerated for their benefit, seemed to evaporate. I didn't walk towards my bedroom to pack sweaters and framed photographs. I walked to the hallway, my gait steady and purposeful, heading straight for the narrow ceiling hatch that led to the attic. I pulled the cord. The ladder descended with a metallic screech, a sound of resistance that felt appropriate. I climbed, ascending into the stifling heat of the upper eaves. The attic smelled of cedar, dry rot, and the sweet, musty scent of decomposing paper, the perfume of old memories. Sunlight pierced through the gaps in the roof tiles, creating beams of dusty light that illuminated the landscape of my past. Stacks of National Geographic, boxes of Christmas ornaments, the crib Mark had slept in, now discarded like me. I navigated the maze with muscle memory, stepping over a broken lamp and ducking under a low beam until I reached the far corner. There it sat. The Doomsday Box. It was a heavy iron-bound trunk my late husband Arthur had commissioned in London. It wasn't locked. Arthur believed locks were for people who had things to hide from thieves, but heavy lids were for people who had things to hide from family. I heaved the lid open. It groaned, revealing a trove not of gold or jewelry, but of something far more valuable: bureaucracy. My fingers, no longer trembling, rifled past the stock certificates and the expired bonds. I wasn't looking for money. I was looking for leverage. I found it at the bottom, a thick manila envelope, the paper yellowed and brittle, sealed with a blob of red wax that bore the imprint of Arthur's signet ring. I broke the seal. The wax cracked with a satisfying snap. I slid the document out, the 1998 deed of trust. I held it up to the sliver of light coming through the roof. I remembered the day I signed this. Mark assumes that because his name is on the utility bills, he owns the walls. He assumes that the power of attorney I signed last year to help him manage his own gambling debts disguised as investments transferred the title to him. Poor, arrogant boy. He never read the fine print. He never checked the county records. This house is not an asset. It is an entity held within the Martha E. Holloway Revocable Living Trust, and I am the sole trustee. I own the floorboards, the roof, the plumbing, and the air inside the rooms. Until my heart stops beating, this house answers only to me. I tucked the document under my arm and descended the ladder. Back in the hallway, the air felt cooler, cleaner. I walked to the telephone table in the alcove, picked up the receiver of the rotary phone. I never saw the point in replacing it, and dialed a number I hadn't called in 5 years. It rang twice. Abernathy and Associates. Hello, George. My voice was crisp, shedding the quaver I used for Jessica. It's Martha. Martha Holloway. A pause. Martha, my goodness, it's been an age. Is everything all right? Far from it, George. But it's about to get interesting. Remember that clause we put in the trust regarding gross ingratitude and the revocation of beneficiary status? I do. It was quite specific. I think it's time to invoke it. I watched my reflection in the hallway mirror, and I looked old, yes, but my eyes were bright, hard. They tried to evict me, George, today, gave me until Friday. Good Lord, shall I send a cease and desist? No, I said softly. Don't warn them. Let them think they've won. I want you to bring the papers on Friday. Come at noon. And George, bring the red stamp, the official one. I hung up. The plan was in motion. I walked into the kitchen. It was a beautiful room filled with copper pots and the warmth of 1,000 meals. Taped to the stainless steel refrigerator, an appliance I had bought for them last Christmas, was a large sheet of graph paper, Jessica's renovation plans. I leaned in closer. She had drawn thick black lines through my island. Notes were scrawled in her jagged handwriting. Gut cabinetry. Remove vintage tile. Install minimalist gray units. Open concept. She wanted to erase me. She wanted to turn my sanctuary into a sterile gray hospital waiting room. I traced the lines of her drawing with my finger, feeling the texture of the paper. A cold smile touched my lips. She was planning a future in a house that didn't belong to her. She was measuring curtains for a window she would soon be looking in from the outside. I turned away from the fridge. I didn't go to the pantry to find boxes for packing. I reached for the flour canister. I reached for the sugar. I reached for the rolling pin. If they were coming for me on Friday, they would find me ready. and nothing smells quite as deceivingly domestic as a freshly baked apple pie. Let the scent waft through the house when they return. Let them think I am soothing myself with comfort food. Let them eat pie. It will be the last sweet thing they taste in this house. Who knew legal vengeance could feel so much like baking? Friday arrived not with a bang, but with the guttural, mechanical chugging of a diesel engine. The moving van Jessica had hired, a monstrosity of white metal painted with a garish red logo promising fast and painless relocation, was idling in my driveway. The sound was a low, persistent vibration that rattled the single-pane glazing of the bay windows, a crude invasion of modern noise against the historic stillness of my home. The exhaust fumes, thick and oily, drifted through the cracks in the old window frames, tainting the air with the smell of burnt fuel and impatience. I was positioned exactly where I had been on Tuesday. The wingback chair, the floral upholstery, the Earl Grey tea. To the untrained eye, nothing had changed. I was still the passive grandmother, waiting to be collected like a bundle of old newspapers. But the atmosphere in the room was different. It was sharper, denser. Standing by the marble fireplace, his silhouette cutting a severe line against the mantel, was George Abernathy. At 70, George still wore his suits like armor, charcoal gray wool perfectly tailored with a silk tie the color of dried blood. He didn't look like a family friend today. He looked like a shark that had smelled blood in the water and was patiently circling the raft. He checked his pocket watch, the gold casing catching a glint of sunlight. "Noon," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "They are punctual." "Greed usually is," I replied, taking a small, measured sip of tea. The front door opened. This time there was no hesitation. Jessica led the charge, dressed in expensive athletic leisure wear, ready to direct the heavy lifting. Mark trailed behind her, looking nauseous. They bustled into the living room, bringing the frantic energy of the outside world with them. "All right, Martha, the guys are here. Let's get the—" Jessica's voice died in her throat. She froze. Her eyes scanned the room. She looked at the bookshelves, still packed with leather-bound volumes. She looked at the mantel where the antique clock still ticked. She looked at the floor, expecting cardboard towers. There were no boxes, not one. The room was pristine, exactly as it had been for 20 years. "Where are your boxes?" Jessica shrieked, the sound tearing through the calm I had cultivated. She spun around, her ponytail whipping. "The movers charge by the hour. We have a schedule. This is unbelievably selfish, Martha. Do you expect us to pack your trash for you?" Mark stepped forward, rubbing his temples. "Grandma, please, don't make a scene. We don't have time for this. Just get your coat. We can pack the rest later." I slowly lowered my teacup. Clink. The sound of the china hitting the saucer was soft, yet it seemed to echo like a gavel strike in a silent courtroom. I looked at Mark. I looked at the man who had grown up eating my cookies, who now couldn't even look me in the eye as he tried to evict me. "I agree," I said, my voice ice cold and clear. "Someone should pack, but it isn't me." Jessica opened her mouth to scream again, but movement by the fireplace caught her eye. She finally noticed George. He stepped forward, emerging from the shadows like a reaper. In his hand, he held a single document printed on heavy, cream-colored bond paper. "Who is this?" Jessica demanded, pointing a manicured finger. "Mr. Abernathy," Mark whispered, his face draining of color. He knew. Deep down, he knew. "Mr. Mark Holloway," Abernathy said, ignoring Jessica entirely. He extended the paper. "This is for you." Mark took it. His hands were shaking so badly the paper fluttered like a captured bird. "What is this?" Jessica snatched the paper from Mark's hands. A will? Is she dying?" "It is a notice of revocation of tenancy," Abernathy stated, his diction precise, every consonant a razor blade, "and a formal notice of removal from the living trust." "Trust?" Jessica scoffed, scanning the document, her eyes widening as she struggled with the legal jargon. "This house is Mark's inheritance. We have rights. He pays the electric bill. That establishes tenancy. You can't just kick us out. We have 30 days minimum by state law." "Incorrect," Abernathy countered, clasping his hands behind his back. "Paying utilities in exchange for room and board constitutes a guest-at-will arrangement, not a lease. And frankly, you are 2 months behind on those payments. I have the bank records here." He tapped his breast pocket. "Furthermore, the property is solely owned by the Martha H. Miller Trust. Martha is the trustee. You are guests. And as of this morning, your guest status has been revoked due to hostile intent." "Hostile intent?" Jessica laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. "We're trying to put her in a home. It's for her own good. Coercing a senior citizen into a facility against their will, threatening them with homelessness and financial manipulation." Abernathy paused, letting the words hang in the air. "These are grounds for a restraining order, which I have prepared should you refuse to vacate." Mark was reading the document over Jessica's shoulder. I watched the realization hit him. It wasn't just about the house. He was reading the clause about the assets, the stocks, the bonds, the savings. "Grandma," Mark choked out, his voice cracking, "the trust. It says I'm removed as beneficiary?" "Gross ingratitude," I said, meeting his gaze. "It's a standard clause, Mark. You tried to throw me away. Did you really think I would leave you the fortune to pay for it?" The room fell silent. The only sound was the idling truck outside. The $800,000 house, the estate, the future they had banked on. It had all evaporated in the span of 30 seconds. Jessica looked at the document, then at the house, then at me. Her face contorted, the arrogance crumbling into sheer, unadulterated panic. "You can't do this," she whispered. I stood up then. I smoothed the front of my dress. I walked over to the window and looked at the moving van. "You have a truck outside," I said, turning back to face them. "How fortunate. You have exactly 1 hour to fill it with your things, your clothes, your IKEA furniture, your minimalist decor. Whatever is left inside my house at 5 p.m. will be donated to the Salvation Army." I checked the grandfather clock. "You have 59 minutes. I suggest you start with the nursery." I watched them scramble, the panic setting in, their greed turning into desperate salvage. But as I watched my grandson weep while dragging a suitcase down the stairs, a chilling thought occurred to me. I had saved the house. I had saved my dignity. But as I looked at the empty space on the wall where Mark's graduation photo used to hang, I wondered for the first time if the victory was worth the silence that was about to follow. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck the quarter hour, a deep, resonant chime that seemed to mock the frenetic energy consuming the first floor. It was a spectacle of absolute, undignified chaos. For 59 minutes, my home transformed into a theater of panic. The serenity of the Victorian architecture stood in stark contrast to the frantic scurrying of its temporary occupants. I stood by the archway of the living room, a silent sentinel, watching the dismantling of their entitlement. It was not a graceful exit. There were no neatly taped boxes or labeled bins. There was only the rustle of black plastic garbage bags, the kind usually reserved for lawn trimmings, being stuffed violently with cashmere sweaters and silk blouses. Jessica was no longer the commander. She was a whirlwind of fury and sweat, her expensive foundation streaked with tears and rage. "I told you," she shrieked, hauling a tangled armful of hangers towards the door. "I told you to check the paperwork. You said it was airtight, Mark. You said she was senile." "I thought it was," Mark yelled back, his voice cracking under the strain of carrying a massive, curved gaming monitor that looked ridiculous against his suit. "She signed the power of attorney. How was I supposed to know about the trust?" "Because you're an idiot," she screamed, dropping a bag. A bottle of expensive face cream rolled out, spinning across the hardwood floor until it hit the base of the wall with a dull thud. I watched the bottle roll. I didn't move to pick it up. They stripped the rooms of their influence. The espresso machine that sounded like a jet engine. Gone. The abstract metal sculpture that looked like a car accident. Gone. The yoga mats, the protein powders, the aggressive modernity they had tried to inject into my sanctuary. All of it was shoved into the back of the white van. The movers, sensing the domestic volatility, worked in silence, avoiding eye contact, treating the furniture like evidence at a crime scene. As the clock hand ticked closer to the deadline, the house began to breathe again. The clutter of their lives was receding, leaving the bones of the house exposed and clean. At 4:58 p.m., the last bag was thrown into the truck. The driver slammed the metal shutter down with a finality that rang through the neighborhood. Mark stood on the porch, his chest heaving. He looked stripped down, younger, and terrified. The arrogance of the business suit was gone, replaced by the slumped posture of a boy who realizes the safety net has been cut. He looked at the van where Jessica was already sitting in the passenger seat, staring furiously at her phone, refusing to look at him. Then he looked at me. "Grandma," he pleaded, his voice small. He took a step toward me, reaching out a hand. "Grandma, please. Where are we supposed to go? We don't have an apartment lined up. I don't have the money for a deposit." I looked at his hand. It was soft, uncalloused. The hand of a man who had never had to build his own roof because he was too busy waiting for mine to collapse. I didn't step forward to hug him. I didn't reach into my purse for my checkbook to smooth over his mistake. I didn't offer the guest room just for a few nights. That enablement was what had led us here. "You have a job, Mark," I said, my voice steady, carrying over the idling engine of the truck. "And you have a wife. I suggest you rely on those." "But, goodbye, Mark." I raised my hand, not in a blessing, but in a simple, stiff wave, a dismissal. He stared at me for a long moment, waiting for the crack in the armor, waiting for the iron lady to melt back into the doting grandmother. But the kiln of the last 3 days had fired the clay. I remained motionless. He turned, defeated, and walked down the steps. He climbed into the driver's seat of the van. The engine revved, a harsh, grinding noise, and they pulled away, tires crunching on the gravel, leaving a cloud of exhaust that slowly dissipated in the late afternoon breeze. I stood on the porch until the van disappeared around the bend of the lane. The silence rushed back in to fill the void, heavy and sweet. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A single vibration. I pulled it out. A text message from Mark. She left me. She had the driver stop at the corner. She got an Uber to her mom's. She said she's filing for divorce. "Grandma, I'm alone." I looked at the words glowing on the screen. The predictability of it was almost boring. Jessica hadn't married Mark. She had married the heir to the Holloway house. With the inheritance gone, the love had evaporated faster than her cheap perfume. He was learning the hardest lesson of his life tonight, that value is not the same as worth. I hovered my thumb over the reply button. I could tell him I told him so. I could tell him to come back. Instead, I pressed delete. The message vanished. He needed to sit in the silence. He needed to find his own way out of the dark. I turned and walked back inside, closing the heavy oak door. The latch clicked shut, sealing the world out. The house was quiet. Dust motes danced in the shafts of golden hour light, undisturbed by shouting or high heels. I walked into the kitchen, the heels of my sensible shoes clicking rhythmically on the linoleum. I stopped in front of the refrigerator. The renovation plans were still taped there. The gray cabinets, the gutted walls, the erasure of my history. I reached up, caught the corner of the graph paper, and ripped it down. The tape gave way with a sharp zip. I crumpled the paper into a tight ball, feeling the resistance of the fibers, and tossed it into the trash can. It landed on top of the apple peels from my pie. I walked back to the living room. The sun was dipping low, casting long, dramatic shadows across the Persian rug. I sat down in my wingback chair. I picked up my knitting, the gray wool soft and familiar against my skin. I reached for my tea. It was cold, but I didn't mind. On the wall beside me, where a generic landscape painting had hung, there was a new addition. I had framed it an hour ago while they were screaming upstairs, the 1998 Deed of Trust. It caught the last light of the day, the wax seal gleaming like a drop of fresh blood. I took a long, peaceful sip of tea, tasting the bergamot and the victory. They wanted the space, I whispered to the empty, beautiful room. I gave them the whole world to find it in. Secrets have a way of surfacing, don't they? If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel. I have many more locked away in this library, waiting for you.